We have to go, now.
What's happening? I'm scared.
The police are here. It's not safe. Help me with the chair.
Go. Hurry!
It started like any other quiet evening in our neighborhood, the kind of place where everything looks perfect on the surface, with neatly trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, and neighbors who smile just enough to seem polite, but never enough to really connect. The air was calm. The street was silent except for the soft hum of my daughter. Lily's oxygen machine, a sound that had become part of our life so constant that I barely noticed it anymore. But that sound meant everything because it meant she was breathing. It meant she was safe after her condition worsened months ago. That machine wasn't just equipment. It was survival, and every decision I made, every step I took, revolved around making sure it never stopped working. Lily sat near the window in her wheelchair, watching the fading daylight with a quiet expression that always broke my heart, because she used to run through that same yard before everything changed. Before hospitals, before diagnoses, before machines became part of our home. And even though she tried to stay strong, I could see it in her eyes, the exhaustion, the frustration of being trapped in a body that wouldn't cooperate. And as her father, there was nothing more painful than knowing I couldn't fix it. I could only protect her, or at least I thought I could, until the first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a letter slipped under our door. A clean, official-looking notice stamped with the HOA logo, complaining about excessive mechanical noise. At first I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe it was meant for someone else. Maybe it was about construction down the street. But when I read it again and saw the reference to continuous humming during quiet hours, my stomach dropped, because deep down I already knew exactly what they were talking about. And I remember standing there in the middle of the living room holding that paper while the very sound they were complaining about filled the silence. Around me it felt unreal, like someone had crossed a line. It shouldn't even exist. Who complains about a medical device, who files a violation against something keeping a child alive? But before I could even process it, there was a knock on the door, sharp, deliberate, the kind that doesn't wait for an answer. And when I opened it, there she was, standing perfectly straight, holding her clipboard like it was a badge of authority. Her expression, tight, controlled eyes scanning past me into the house, as if she already owned the place. She introduced herself formally, even though everyone in the neighborhood already knew who she was, the woman who enforced every rule, no matter how small, no matter how unreasonable. And as she spoke about regulations and standards, I could feel something shift inside me, because this wasn't just about noise. This was about control. And the way she looked at that machine, the way her eyes lingered on it with quiet disapproval, made it clear that she didn't see it as something necessary. She saw it as a problem. And in that moment I realized this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. This was the beginning of something much worse. The next few days didn't feel normal anymore, even though nothing obvious had changed on the outside. The same cars were parked along the street, the same sprinklers went off in the early morning, and the same neighbors walked their dogs pretending everything was fine. But something invisible had shifted, something heavy and uncomfortable, like the entire neighborhood had quietly taken a step back from us. And I could feel it in the way conversations stopped when I walked by, in the way doors closed just a little too quickly, and in the way people avoided eye contact, as if simply acknowledging me might somehow drag them into trouble. And maybe they were right, because dealing with someone like her was never simple. It was never just one complaint or one warning. It was always something bigger, something that kept growing until it consumed everything. And I tried to ignore it at first. I really did, because I had more important things to focus on, like making sure Lily was comfortable, like checking her oxygen levels, like keeping her calm when she had those moments where her breathing became uneven and panic started creeping into her eyes. And every time that machine hummed beside her, it grounded me. It reminded me that despite everything, she was still here, still fighting, still holding on, and that was all that mattered. But then the second notice came, and this one didn't feel like a mistake. It felt targeted. The wording was colder, more direct, stating that failure to resolve the violation could result in further action, and that phrase stayed in my head long after. I read it, further action, because what exactly did that mean? What action could they possibly take against a medical necessity? And I remember sitting at the kitchen table, staring at that paper while Lily watched me from the living room, her expression quiet but observant because she always noticed more than people realized, and she asked me softly if everything was okay, and I forced a smile, the kind that parents use when they don't want their children to worry, and I told her it was nothing, just some paperwork, but deep down I knew it wasn't nothing, because later that afternoon there was another knock on the door, and this time it wasn't polite, it wasn't formal, it was persistent, like someone determined to be heard, and when I opened it, she didn't wait for an invitation, she stepped forward. Just enough to assert her presence without crossing the line completely. Her clipboard already in hand, her pen tapping lightly against the paper as if she had already decided how this conversation would go, and without wasting time she pointed toward the living room, toward the machine, and said that we had been given a warning that the noise issue had not been resolved and that this was now considered a violation of community standards, and I could feel my patience slipping, but I kept my voice steady, as if explained again that it wasn't optional, that it wasn't something we could just turn off or replace, that it was medical equipment necessary for my daughter to breathe, and for a brief moment I thought maybe, just maybe, something in my words would reach her, that some level of basic human understanding would break through the rigid structure of rules she hid behind, but it didn't, because instead of listening, she repeated herself almost word for word, like she was reading from a script about maintaining neighborhood peace and acceptable noise levels, and it was in that moment that the realization hit me. This wasn't about misunderstanding, this wasn't about lack of information, she knew exactly what it was, she just didn't care, and behind me I could feel Lily watching the entire exchange, her small hands gripping the armrests of her wheelchair, her eyes moving between us, trying to understand why someone would be upset about something that was helping her stay alive. And that look in her eyes, that confusion mixed with fear, it hit me harder than anything Karen could say, because children aren't supposed to question whether they deserve to breathe. They aren't supposed to feel like a problem that needs to be fixed or silenced, and yet there we were standing in our own home being told that her survival was inconvenient, and when I told Kieran that there was nothing to resolve, that the machine would stay on, no matter what, her expression changed slightly, not dramatically, not in a way most people would notice, but just enough for me to see it, that small tightening around her eyes, that subtle shift from control to irritation, and she wrote something down on her clipboard slowly, deliberately, before looking back up and saying that if the issue continued, it would be escalated, and that next time there would be consequences. And the way she said that word, consequences, it wasn't a warning, it was a promise. And then she turned and walked away, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. And for a long moment, I just stood there in the doorway, trying to process what had just happened, trying to make sense of how something so simple, so necessary, could become a point of conflict. And when I finally closed the door and turned back, inside Lily was still watching me, her voice quieter this time, as she asked if she had done something wrong, and that question, it broke something inside me, because no child should ever have to ask that. Not for existing, not for needing help, not for fighting to stay alive. And I moved quickly, kneeling beside her, reassuring her that none of this was her fault, that she had done nothing wrong, that she was stronger than anyone who tried to make her feel otherwise. And she nodded slowly, but I could tell she didn't fully believe it, not because she doubted me, but because the world around her was starting to show her something different, something colder, something unfair. And that night I barely slept, because every small sound felt amplified, every shadow felt like a warning, and I kept replaying the conversation over and over in my head, wondering what escalation actually looked like, wondering how far someone like Karen would go to enforce a rule that should never have applied in the first place. And the worst part was not knowing, because uncertainty has a way of growing in the dark, feeding on silence, turning small concerns into overwhelming fear. And as the hours passed, that fear slowly settled into something else, something sharper, something more focused, because deep down I knew this wasn't over, not even close. And whatever came next, it wasn't going to be a letter or a conversation. It was going to be something bigger, something that would force me to act whether I was ready or not. That night didn't feel different at first, which is what makes it harder to forget, because the most dangerous moments rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, slipping into ordinary routines and turning them into something you can never go back from. We had just gotten home later than usual, the air outside colder than expected, the street. Unusually still, as if even the neighborhood itself was holding its breath, and I remember helping Lily inside, carefully guiding her wheelchair over the small bump at the doorway, while the familiar soft hum of her oxygen machine filled the room again, that gentle, steady sound that had become our reassurance, our proof that everything was okay. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to relax, thinking maybe the situation had passed, maybe the warnings were just empty threats meant to scare us into compliance, but that illusion shattered the second I noticed something was wrong. The front door wasn't fully closed. It was slightly open, just enough to let in a thin line of cold air, and before I could even process it, before I could react to that instinctive feeling that something wasn't right, I saw her standing inside, already positioned near the machine like she had been, waiting like she had been watching and timing everything, her posture straight, her expression calm in a way that didn't match the situation, her hand hovering dangerously close to the power switch as if it belonged there, as if she had every right to be in our home, making decisions about what stayed on and what didn't. And for a split second, everything froze, my mind struggling to catch up with what I was seeing, because there are moments in life that feel so wrong, so unreal, that your brain refuses to accept them immediately, and then it hit all at once, the anger, the confusion, the disbelief crashing together as I shouted, asking what she was doing, how she got in, why she thought this was acceptable, but she didn't react the way any normal person would. She didn't step back, she didn't apologize, she didn't even look surprised. She just turned slightly toward me, her voice steady, controlled, as if she were discussing something routine, something insignificant, saying that we had ignored repeated warnings that the violation had continued, that she was now enforcing community regulations. And I remember thinking, this can't be real. This cannot actually be happening, because no one with even the smallest sense of humanity would do what she was about to do. And I moved toward her quickly, my heart racing, my focus locked on that switch, knowing exactly what would happen if she touched it. But I was too late, because without hesitation, without even looking at Lily, without acknowledging the reality of what that machine represented, she flipped it off, and in that instant the sound stopped completely. The hum disappeared like it had never existed, leaving behind a silence so sudden, so unnatural, that it felt like the entire room had been emptied of air. And then came the part I will never forget, the change in Lily's breathing, the way her chest tightened, the way her eyes widened in pure panic, the way her body reacted before words could even form, because survival doesn't wait for explanations, it responds immediately. And I rushed to her, dropping to my knees, my hands shaking as I tried to reconnect everything, my voice breaking as I shouted for Karen to turn it back on, to do something, to fix what she had just done. But she didn't move. She just stood there, repeating the same cold arguments about rules and noise and compliance, as if this were a discussion, as if there were time to debate policies, while my daughter struggled to breathe right in front of her. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. Not just fear, not just anger, but a deeper realization of how dangerous this situation is. Really was, because this wasn't about ignorance anymore. This wasn't someone who didn't understand. This was someone who understood perfectly and chose to act anyway. And I remember grabbing the machine myself, forcing it back on, fumbling with the connections, desperate to restore that sound, that lifeline that should have never been interrupted. And when it finally came back, when that hum returned, filling the room again, it felt like the world had restarted, like everything that had been ripped away in those few seconds had suddenly been given back. But the damage was already done, because Lily was still gasping, still trembling, her eyes filled with tears. Not just from the physical shock, but from the fear, from the confusion, from the realization that someone had the power to take something so essential away from her. And as I held her, trying to calm her, trying to steady my own breathing at the same time, I looked up at Karen, and for the first time, I didn't see an authority figure. I didn't see someone enforcing rules. I saw someone who had crossed a line so far beyond reason that there was no coming back from it. And even then, even after everything she had just done, she still tried to justify. It still tried to maintain that she was right, that the rules allowed this, that the community depended on enforcement, and that was the moment I knew this wasn't going to end quietly. This wasn't something that could be handled with another conversation or another warning, because when someone is willing to go, it's that far when they are willing to risk a life to prove a point. There is only one way forward, and it doesn't involve compromise. It involves consequences. And as the distant sound of sirens began to rise in the background, growing louder with each passing second, I realized that what had just happened inside that room was about to become something much bigger than any HOA complaint. Something that would expose everything. Something that would force the truth into the open, whether she was ready for it or not. Everything after that moment felt like it was happening too fast and too slow at the same time, like reality itself couldn't decide how to process what had just occurred, because 1 second I was still on my knees beside Lily, trying to steady her breathing, whispering to her that everything was okay, even though my own hands were shaking, and the next the sound of sirens grew louder, cutting through the heavy silence outside, until flashing red and blue lights filled the windows, casting moving shadows across the walls, turning our living room into something unrecognizable. And for the first time since she walked in, Karen's composure shifted just slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for me to see that the situation was no longer under her control, because authority only works when no one challenges it. And now that illusion was starting to crack as the knock on the door came firm and undeniable, and before I could even stand fully, it opened, revealing 2 police officers stepping inside, their presence immediately changing the atmosphere in a way nothing else could, because they weren't there to debate rules. They were there to understand what had happened. And I remember one of them looking directly at Lily, then at the oxygen machine, then back at me, his expression tightening as he quickly assessed the situation, asking if she was okay, asking what had happened, and the words came out faster than I could organize them, everything spilling out at once, the notices, the warnings, the argument, and finally, the moment she turned it off. And as I spoke, I could feel the weight of it all settling into the room. The reality of how close we had come to something irreversible. And when the officer turned toward Karen, asking her to explain her side, she didn't hesitate. She straightened her posture, lifted her chin slightly, and began speaking in that same controlled tone, referencing policies and community standards, as if she were presenting a case instead of defending an action that could have cost a life. And for a brief second, it almost felt surreal watching her try to frame what had happened as procedure, as something justified by regulations that were never meant for situations like this. But this time, it didn't land the same way, because now there were witnesses. Now there was context. Now there was a line that had clearly been crossed, and you could see it in the officers' reactions, the subtle exchange of glances, the shift in their stance, the way one of them stepped closer to the machine, examining it more carefully, while the other continued questioning her, asking directly if she had turned it off, and why, and when she confirmed it without hesitation, repeating that it was in violation of noise restrictions. There was a pause, a noticeable break in the flow of the conversation, where everything seemed to hang in the air for just a moment, because even without saying it out loud, everyone in that room understood the seriousness of what she had admitted. And that's when the balance of power fully shifted, because rules can only protect you up to a point. And she had gone far beyond that point, into something much more serious, something that couldn't be explained away with paperwork or authority. And for the first time since this began, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. It's not fear exactly, but something close to it, something that suggested she was starting to realize that this situation wasn't going to end the way she expected. And as the officers continued their questions, their tone becoming firmer, more direct, the narrative she had built began to fall apart piece by piece, because every justification she offered only highlighted the core issue more clearly: that she had knowingly interfered with a medical device, that she had made a decision that directly impacted someone's ability to breathe. And no amount of policy language could change that reality. And meanwhile, I stayed close to Lily, my focus still on her, making sure her breathing had stabilized, feeling the rhythm slowly return to normal, but the emotional weight of what had just happened lingered in the way she held onto my arm tighter than usual, and the way her eyes kept drifting toward Karen, as if trying to understand how someone could do something like that. And I reassured her quietly that she was safe, now that no one was going to turn it off again, that it was over, even though part of me knew that this moment wasn't just an ending, it was the beginning of something else, something that would extend beyond this room, beyond this night, because actions like that don't disappear, they carry consequences, they demand accountability. And as one of the officers finally stepped back and informed Karen that they needed her to come with them, that further investigation would be required there, was a final shift, a complete collapse of the control she had tried so hard to maintain, because in that instant the authority she relied on was placed by something real, something enforceable, something she couldn't override or reinterpret. And as she hesitated, just for a second before moving toward the door, I realized that everything had changed. Not just for her, but for us too, because what started as a complaint about noise had exposed something far more serious, something that forced everyone involved to confront the difference between rules and humanity. And as the flashing lights continued to pulse outside and the door closed behind them, leaving the house quieter than it had ever felt before, I sat there beside Lily, listening to the steady hum of the machine once again, and understanding more clearly than ever how close we had come to losing that sound and how much it truly meant. The days that followed didn't return to normal right away, because some moments leave a mark that doesn't fade quickly, no matter how much time passes. And even though the house was quiet again, and the oxygen machine continued its steady, reassuring hum, filling the space with the sound that once felt ordinary, but now carried a deeper meaning, everything felt different, like we were living in the same place but seeing it through a completely new lens, because once something like that happens, once someone crosses a line that extreme, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to believing that rules are always reasonable or that the people enforcing them always understand the weight of their actions. And as the investigation moved forward, more details came to light. Statements were taken. Neighbors who had stayed silent before finally spoke up, some admitting they had seen the tension building, others confessing they had received similar complaints over much smaller things, but had been too afraid to challenge it because they didn't want to become targets themselves. And slowly the narrative that had been controlled by one person for so long began to shift into something broader, something that revealed a pattern rather than a single incident. And the HOA board was forced to respond not just to what happened in our home, but to the growing realization that their system has allowed something like this to happen in the first place. Policies were reviewed, rules were questioned, and the same structure that had once been used to justify control was now being examined for its failures. And in the middle of all of that, we focused on what mattered most, which was Lily. Because while everything else unfolded around us, she was the one who had lived through that moment. She was the one who felt the fear in its purest form, and recovery for her wasn't just physical, it was emotional. It was about rebuilding a sense of safety that had been shaken in a way no child should ever experience. And I spent more time with her than ever, sitting beside her, talking, listening, making sure she knew without any doubt that what happened was not her fault, that she had done nothing wrong, that needing help was not something to be ashamed of. And slowly, day by day, I could see the change, the way her shoulders relaxed a little more, the way her smile returned. Not all at once, but in small, genuine moments that reminded me of the strength she carried, even after everything. And eventually the outcome came. Karen was removed from her position, her authority, stripped away, not as an act of revenge, but as a necessary step to ensure that no one else would have to face the same situation. And new guidelines were put in place. Clear protections for medical needs rules that couldn't be twisted or misused in the same way again. And while none of that erased what had happened, it created something meaningful out of it, something that extended beyond our own experience into a change that would protect others. And as I stood one evening by the same window where Lily used to sit watching the street, I realized how much had shifted, not just around us, but within us too, because we had been forced to confront something difficult, something uncomfortable about the world we live in. That sometimes the greatest risks don't come from obvious threats, but from ordinary people given authority without empathy. And that understanding doesn't make things easier, but it makes you more aware, more prepared to stand up when it matters most. And as I looked over at Lily resting peacefully, the soft hum of the machine continuing, Without interruption, I felt something I hadn't felt since before that night. A sense of calm, not because everything was perfect, but because we had faced something that tried to take control, something that tried to define what was acceptable at the cost of something essential, and we didn't let it. And if there was one thing that stayed with me after all of it, it was this: that rules should never come before humanity, that no system, no policy, no authority should ever have the power to decide whether someone gets to breathe, and that sometimes standing up against that, even when it feels overwhelming, is the only way to make sure that line is never crossed again.